welcome to another Expert Talk series. I'm so glad to see all of your faces and your smiles and your determination to help us solve this problem. So never be bashful. If you have extra time and you'd like to help us out with one of our studies, contact us and say, you know what? I can help solve this problem too. So that's how we do it. We do it as a group. And what more can I say? But thank you all for coming today. It means so much to all of us. And with that, over to you, Indu.
Thank you, McFinn. And it's our pleasure today to invite Dr. Leigh Hochberg, who holds MD PhD in a vascular and critical care neurologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, which we call MGH, where he also directs the Center of Neurotechnology and Neurorecovery. And we're so excited because Dr. Leigh Hochberg, I've known him for a while, and I am so excited about bringing him here because all of you can get to know his research, which is focused on translation of neurophysiology and computational neuroscience into device to restore function for patients with neurologic disease or injury. His research has been published in journals such as Nature, the New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, Science Translational Medicine, and Journal of Neuroscience. As principal investigator and lead clinical investigator of BrainGate, neural interface system pilot clinical trials, he has earned numerous awards. And Dr. Hochberg also has received his Bachelor of Science with honors from Brown University and MD PhD from Emory University. And with no further ado, I would love to invite Dr. Leigh Hochberg.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And McFinn, thank you for the welcome, and Sarita and everybody else at Everything ALS. Thanks for tuning in this afternoon and this evening. It's really a privilege for me to be back here. I think I last had the opportunity to join you about 3 years ago in the depths of many ways of the pandemic. My job for the first part of today is going to be to tell you about some ongoing research in implantable brain-computer interfaces for people with ALS. As you'll note, I'm going to focus a bit on the BrainGate research with which I'm most familiar and participating. But I am also going to touch on other mostly implantable brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, along the way, and also mention a few others, at least in one slide. A few disclosures, a standard slide to begin this type of presentation. No personal financial disclosures. I am quite grateful for the ongoing support of a number of federal and philanthropic institutions, and there's some institutional disclosures that are listed there at the bottom. I will say that everything that I'm going to talk about in terms of implantable devices today, they are all, I'm just pausing for a moment to make sure it's true, but they're all investigational devices at this point. So that important caveat. Most important disclosure by far, though, and really resonating on some of the discussion that we were having just before we got started here, there's the great group of people that I get to work with every day, and the community that I get to learn from every day across a number of institutions and a number of disciplines. And as is typical in a slide like this, I'd encourage you to all ignore most of the people whose faces you see, because the people who actually did the work are in a traditionally smaller font there on the right, including our students and colleagues from across the country and really around the world. So I'm going to begin, as Indu mentioned, I spend some of my time as a neurointensive care physician, that is a critical care neurologist in the neuro ICU. And when I'm there, as I was just last week, I'm often having some of the same thoughts that I have when I have my research hat on. You'll see they're very similar goals. And I'll start quite directly by saying that when I meet somebody in the neuro ICU who has ALS, and if I'm seeing that person in the neuro ICU, they likely are losing or have lost spontaneous ventilation as the result of ALS. I want more than anything to be able to tell that person, or somebody who I'm meeting in the clinic for the first time who's recently been diagnosed with ALS, that they will never lose the ability to communicate. If I meet somebody in the ICU to step away from ALS for just a moment, who just had a brainstem stroke, who yesterday was without any physical disability, was walking and talking, and suddenly became locked in, the LIS there representing locked in syndrome, I want to be able to tell that person that they will be able to communicate again easily tomorrow. And for somebody with spinal cord injury or stroke, I'd like to be able to assure them that they'll be able to move again easily tomorrow. Those are clinical hopes. They are also research mission statements. And I think the implantable brain-computer interfaces that I'm going to be telling you about today are well on a path to achieving those goals. None of them there quite yet, but hopefully I'll be able to convince you that there's been some really good progress made over just the last few years. So brain-computer interfaces, a decade ago, not that familiar of a term. Now, for a number of reasons, increasingly understood, commonly called a BCI. And any BCI that you hear about, whether it's from me today or any other in the news or other academic presentations or industry presentations, all BCIs have three very similar components. They all involve some sort of sensor, a decoder, and an assistive technology. I'm a neurologist, so that's an icon of a person from the neurologist view in some ways. But for somebody who is losing the ability to move or is losing the ability to speak, for a BCI, we need to answer some questions as we're designing this technology in order for the technology to work once it gets launched into clinical trials. So the first is, what signal from the brain do we want to record from? That is, there's lots of different types of signals. There's electrical signals and chemical signals, and some that can be picked up with magnets and other types of signals that we could be considering, some related to blood flow. So we have to choose a signal that we're interested in. Everything I'll tell you about today uses electrical signals from the brain, perhaps not surprising, but there are others. We also have to think about what area or areas of the brain we want to record from. And then when we know what signal we want and what areas we want to make our BCI, then we choose the sensor or sensors that are able to record that particular signal from that particular area. Once, for any given BCI, that signal is in hand, that signal is available, it gets put into what, for just a moment, I'll describe as a black box. And that black box is the home of my friends in computational neuroscience who are taking the signal that's available, that is the signal that's generated voluntarily by somebody as they attempt to move or attempt to speak. And the goal is to convert that signal, which is here referred to as a firing rate, which are of action potentials of neurons in the brain, being converted back into the intended hand motion. And what's sitting between those two is math. Math here represented by the letter A. I get a dirty look from my friends in computational neuroscience who are a little disappointed that I've reduced their entire career to the letter A. But it is math. It is software that is being written to take complex neural signals and to convert it back into the use, which I'll mention in just a moment, that is intended for. When we're designing a BCI, we do have to think about what that BCI is going to be able to do. For somebody who's losing the ability to gain control over their tablet computer or to control other communication technologies or to speak, if we could restore the ability to type on a computer screen or to pinch and swipe and use that tablet computer or laptop computer, if we could turn intended speech back into speech and any number of the other technologies that are listed there, those would likely be helpful towards restoring, improving, maintaining quality of life. There are different systems that I won't really focus on today that take this BCI concept and then return signals not for control of a computer or speech or computer-generated speech output, but return those decoded signals back to the nervous system. And I mentioned just briefly that some of these types of technologies, sometimes called closed-loop deep brain stimulation technologies may become helpful in the future and even currently for the treatment of movement disorders and perhaps even the management of some mental health disorders. So that kind of chalkboard diagram is the basis of essentially all brain-computer interface work. Sticking for just a moment with a few more cartoons, in our particular BrainGate trial, which is just one of several ongoing brain-computer interface efforts, the sensor that we use is the 4x4 millimeter array called a Utah array. One or more of these is placed neurosurgically into the top of the cortex. It's connected, you can see here, by some fine wires that are connected up to a pedestal that's secured to the top of the head. This particular investigational technology is percutaneous, that is, protrudes up through the top of the scalp, which allows for a connection to be made by a cable. I'll show you a couple different types of cables getting progressively smaller. And if everything works in this field the way that we want it to, somebody who may be unable to use their hand could, for example, control a cursor on a computer screen just by thinking about the movement of their own hand. In our BrainGate research, as I'll tell you about in just a moment, there have been 18 participants enrolled into the study. Down below are estimates of other groups that are doing similar implanted brain-computer interface research, about another 18 or so across academic institutions in the US and elsewhere using the same Utah array, and then towards the bottom, some other technologies that I'll mention in a moment. But all told, as far as I can tell, there's no more than 50 or so people worldwide over the past 20 plus years who have had an implanted brain-computer interface placed for the purpose of neuroprosthetic research, that is placed chronically for the purpose of building this field. The sensors, because there are several BCIs now under development, can really be placed anywhere from the top of the head and into the brain. So this is a cross-section, as you can tell, of a brain down here and the scalp up at the top. There are some BCIs that use sensors that sit on the top of the head. I won't really be discussing those in any more detail today. There are some that are placed under the skull in one or two different ways, either in the skull, which is represented here, under the skull, represented here, an ECOG or an electrocorticography interface, or into a blood vessel, particularly the large vein that sits right across the center of the brain called the superior sagittal sinus. And there's a method to place that investigational device as well. And then finally, devices can be placed so that they can record from inside the brain, even if it's only barely inside the brain, that is a couple of millimeters. And one of these devices is the array that I'm telling you about largely today, called the Utah array, and other devices that are under development as well. So when you hear about a BCI, one of the questions that you'll want to ask and find out more about is where exactly are they recording and how is that device placed? This slide mostly, very purposefully meant to attract your interest. If you're interested in learning more about these trials, this was my probably imperfect attempt to alphabetize and then to list all the academic institutions that, at least at a quick glance, I know are engaged in some sort of implanted or implantable brain-computer interface trial. There are also industry trials that are either going on or are anticipated to be happening. I've listed their websites here. And I will mention two of these companies really just because they have active trials that are ongoing, and others both listed here and others in the future will as well. I'll pause on the slide for just a moment because there's a QR code there. The Stentrode, that is the vascular interface that I mentioned before, is ongoing pilot clinical trial from a company called Synchron, and there's more information down there. I'll point out synchronbci.com and their QR code. And also a company called Neuralink, their QR code. There's a little bit more information about their ongoing clinical trial and a link to their registry down below. So one of the ways to find out more about these clinical trials is, of course, to get in contact directly with the sponsors, which are either the academic institutions themselves or the companies that are sponsoring these trials and working with academic institutions to do so. we were talking about Parkinson's disease just briefly before we started today, and this is a really important message. Of course, Michael J. Fox, and his quote here is something that just rings true to me every day. This second sentence, that the people living with the condition are the experts. There is no doubt about that. You all know that extraordinarily well. And we learned that in our clinical trials working with people with ALS and other forms of paralysis who provide us extraordinary feedback every day on how well these investigational devices are working, what we've gotten right, what we need to continue to work on. And this field of brain-computer interfaces has become so exciting and has grown so quickly. And there's been such rapid entry from multiple companies just in the past handful of years into the space that just in the past few months, we've launched, after about a year's worth of ramp-up time, something called the Implantable BCI Collaborative Community, which is up there at ibci-cc.org. And this, an important transition, I was telling you about clinical trials earlier. This is not a clinical trial site per se, but it is importantly an opportunity for stakeholders that really represent the diverse group of people who are absolutely integral to figuring out how brain-computer interfaces should be developed and approved and tested and considered and made available. So there will be people with lived experience, most important components and people in this collaborative community, care partners, academics, industry representatives. This is wonderfully, the FDA is participating in this collaborative community, as it does with about another 16 or so collaborative communities in other medical device spaces. This is the first collaborative community with FDA participation in the clinical neurosciences. And so I've spent a moment talking about this mostly because if you're interested in helping to think about the future of this field, I encourage you to reach out to this website. There's a join button up there in the upper right, and a chance to learn more about what I think is going to be a really helpful opportunity to craft the future of these particular devices and their clinical trials. All right, so having said that, return to the BrainGate research in particular, which is an ongoing feasibility study. We're recruiting people who have motor neuron disease or spinal cord injury, stroke, or muscular dystrophy. This, like many of these trials, recruiting adults who are at least a year or so out from either injury or diagnosis. Currently, we can recruit people who are able to communicate, but not necessarily people who are able to speak. That is, if somebody is able to use their eyes or another assistive technology sufficiently to provide informed consent, that is, even slowly to ask and answer questions, we can and we have recruited them into our BrainGate research. And people in these trials live within 3 hours of any of our study sites. And that's because after the devices are placed, which of course in our case happens in an operating room in a sterile environment, the participants return home. And for nearly 20 years now, this research has happened itself not in the ivory tower of the academic medical center, where I happen to be sitting at the moment, but where we thought the device actually needed to be developed and tested, which is in somebody's home, in their living room, in their dining room, where there may be other people around, where the dog may hop onto somebody's lap at some point. We needed to test this device and learn how this device would work in the real world. And this ongoing trial across the cities listed here, some of those academic institutions being mentioned earlier, and its clinicaltrials.gov site. Whenever thinking about a clinical trial, particularly one of an implanted device, you want to think a bit about safety. Very pleased that we, after 17 years of doing this, or collecting 17 years of data and 14 participants in our BrainGate research, we were able to publish just last year, it's Dan Rubin in the upper left-hand corner, the encouraging interim, because it's an ongoing study, safety profile of this BrainGate system that is implantable multiple arrays in cortex, including people with ALS, spinal cord injury, or stroke. If you decide to read this, I told you in advance, this is one of the most boring papers you will ever read, which is a good thing, of course, if it's a safety report and really does speak to the encouraging safety profile of this type of implanted device, one that I certainly hope continues and I hope is true for other implanted devices as well. quick summary of our BrainGate trial through yesterday when I updated the slide. There have been people in our trial for multiple years. There are 4 participants in our trial at this moment. There are some adverse events and serious adverse events. We list the summary of them here, much more detail in the paper. The asterisks represent those that are related to the trial itself. And thankfully, those have been few and readily dealt with, and people continuing in the trial. There are, of course, other things that have happened unrelated to the trial that are listed here. The real reason I'm putting this on the screen, though, is that if we count the people who have been in this trial, the amazing participants who have joined us, we now have amassed more than 15,000 days of participation in this trial. And either for good or not so good reasons, we decide to count the number of rays, that is those little 4 by 4 millimeter sensors that have been in the brain and how long they've been in the brain in our trial. We get up to 26,000 plus days. And I only mention this because this is the type of data that I think is really important and helpful towards demonstrating or at least assessing the safety of an implanted device. And the fact that we're able to continue to do this and others are as well speaks to the encouraging safety profile. So let me turn to some videos. You're looking at 2 people, both of whom have ALS. Woman on the left has one of these tiny rays in the brain with a small percutaneous pedestal that you can't see because attached to it is what I used to call a medium because I was trying to be conservative, but let's just call a big cable that is attached to this pedestal. The good news is that that cable and that size cable has basically gone away, and I'm going to show you smaller cables in just a moment. It's going back to a rack of computers, but what she's doing right now is controlling her tablet computer just by thinking about the movement of her own hand. And she's sending an email. This is an unmodified tablet computer. As she thinks about moving her own hand, she's moving the cursor on the screen to point and click on that keyboard, and she's sending an email, in this case to Paul Nurjukian, who is then a postdoc and now a assistant professor of engineering out of Stanford. I think importantly, this is not an assistive technology. This is a communication technology, and it's the same communication technology used by people who are able-bodied and possibly being used by some people on the call tonight in order to join us on Zoom. Gentleman on the right also has ALS. You can tell that they're both mechanically ventilated. He had 2 arrays in the brain, 2 small pedestals, 2 biggish cables that are attached to it. And those cables are going to get smaller and a handful of slides. He just did a YouTube search, and in the lower right-hand corner, the 2 of them texting with each other using this investigational technology. So for me, when I go back to those mission statements, whether I'm in the ICU or doing our BrainGate, brain-computer interface research, I said that what I want to be able to tell people, what we'd all like to be able to say with confidence, is that you'll never lose the ability to communicate. And one of the ways that I mean that is that you'll always be able to use the same industry scale tablet computer or other communication technology that you were using before the onset of illness or weakness. Here's a gentleman in our trial. You can kind of see him on the right. You certainly see his hand. What we've done here is to connect that BrainGate system to a soft robotic device. That glove is sometimes referred to as soft robotics or wearable robotics. And it's Connor Walsh in the upper right-hand corner from the Harvard School of Engineering, Sabrina Paganoni, some of you may recognize from the Healy Center here at MGH, and there's a ALS neurologist, and Jay Guzman in the upper left, one of my PhD students in biomedical engineering at Brown. I'll play the video. Even though it's subtle, what our participant in the trial is thinking is about opening his hand or making a pinching movement or making a power grip or moving his wrist in any number of ways. And without cables, without pulleys, without steel, without a hard exoskeleton, this is a wearable robotic that's allowing him to move his hand intuitively just by thinking about moving his hand that way. And this, I think, is early days without a doubt, but is on its way to becoming a technology that could be helpful for people with ALS. There's ongoing trials of just this and related systems for people with ALS. And in our BrainGate research, we're combining the intention to move with the control of these soft wearable robotics. One method for communication for people who are able-bodied is handwriting. And one of the questions that we asked early, it's Frank Willett in the upper left-hand corner, part of the BrainGate team at Stanford, and he and his colleagues asked one of our participants to intend or to attempt to write cursive letters. And the green squiggles that you see there on the right are what I might call a neural trajectory. But as you can tell, those squiggles look like cursive letters. And that we can decode that activity. And that would be a communication technology by itself, but it's not the fastest way to do this. Another way to do this is to take this high resolution, extremely informative information that is gathered from ensembles of neurons inside the brain from the motor cortex. Kind of looks like this. And then to put it through a recurrent neural network and to begin to use language models to decode from just a brief snippet of neural activity, which of the 26 letters and a handful of characters of punctuation he was trying to write. And I'll show you that in just a second. But I will point out that what I'm really talking about here is the application of artificial intelligence and towards these neural prostheses, towards decoding brain activity, and particularly considering everything ALS, its Vision 2030 initiative. I think this use of AI in various ways, deep learning, machine learning, and language models to decode brain activity is one of the most exciting advances in brain-computer interfaces, and I'm confident that its application is going to help to restore communication and mobility. So here's one of the participants in our trial. We've asked him a question, which is up there on the screen. One more highlight to the big cable. It's still going to go away, I promise. He is attempting to write one letter at a time. We are decoding in real time that neural activity. And as we decode each letter, that letter, and therefore that word, is appearing on the screen. When we published this a few years ago, so this is a full vocabulary. It's all 26 letters, handful of characters of punctuation. He was able to write nearly 90 characters per minute, one letter at a time. And it was about 94-ish% accurate out of the box when we apply a language model to it. Same language model that corrects, that does the autocorrect, sometimes right, sometimes not, on any word processor or text message. It got up to 99% accurate. And just to prove that it's not perfectly accurate, we missed the R here, so we still have some work to do. But here's another example of one potential method of communication technology just through an implantable brain-computer interface. You're looking at another participant in our trial who's here. This is Ronnie Gross and Tyler Singer-Clark, two of the engineers on the BrainGate team. Our participant is looking at two devices right now, and they're a little more clearly demonstrated there on the screen grabs on the right. The first is his Windows PC. The other is an iPad, so different operating systems. And for somebody who's able-bodied, the ability to reach out and grab one device or a coffee cup versus a pencil, or to be using their tablet computer and then maybe the other PC on their desk. That is intuitive, and we want to make sure that we can create that same type of function and power. So between these two, though, we need to create an app, which we're here calling BG Home or BrainGate Home. And this app takes the neural activity, allows somebody to purposefully switch between devices. And I'll press play in just a moment, and you'll see, I think this is Kindle Reader that's up on the screen. He's reading, he's going to make an intended action with his hand, and then he's going to switch to the iPad, and you'll see that in a moment. But what I do want to point out is that, as promised, I've made the big cable go away, not me, the outstanding engineering team in this case at Brown and together with BlackRock and who helps to manufacture these. This device is a wireless transmitter of that same neural activity. So at least in this particular use, big cable's gone away, wireless, the transmitted neural activity is going back to the decoding systems. I've now pressed play, the cursor's moving over there. He's made a few quick intended actions of his hand. It's immediately switched, so he now has control of the iPad. And he's brought up GarageBand. And here, you hopefully will begin to hear a little bit of sound in the background. he is using GarageBand, which, as some people on the call will know, is a music making app on that's using on the iPad. I'll tell you about this text in just a moment. He's pointing and clicking. He's picking the instruments that are available down there. In the interest of time, I'm going to speed ahead because I want you all to hear the beats that he's laying down. And I could listen to that all night. But I want to point out a couple other things about. One is that this is a cognitively demanding task. He has to choose the instrument. He has to choose where he wants exactly where he wants that beat to go, and move the cursor to it. And he does so with ease. And in fact, if you caught some of the text that kind of sped by at just the beginning, our research assistant was trying to give him some suggestions, and he basically replied, "I got this." And in some ways, it speaks to the power of an implantable brain-computer interface that this kind of intuitive action can be used for control of an external device. But I think more importantly, it speaks to what the motor cortex does, which is it ordinarily controls an external device, for example, the hand. And for somebody who's able-bodied, being able to reach out and pick up a coffee cup or grab a pencil or type, those activities can all happen while the rest of the brain is kind of doing something else. It's thinking about whatever it's thinking about, and harnessing that rich activity that is so immediately present during an intended action is part of what brings implantable brain-computer interfaces to, I think, the progress, at least, that they've made to date. So let me turn back to somebody with ALS. You're looking at the back of somebody's head, a woman with bulbar onset ALS. We've talked about typing, talked about handwriting, talked about control of different apps. Another important way of communication is speech. And so here, the arrays have been placed slightly more laterally in the brain, more to the side, away from part of the brain to some extent that controls the hand, and closer to parts of the brain that controls speech. And it's Frank Willett again in the upper left-hand corner. We published this last year. You'll see again that I've made the cables. I keep taking credit for it. I deserve none. The cables have been made much smaller. These are the small amplifiers, or head stages, more precisely, that are placed on top of that pedestal, and the mini HDMI cables that are still going back to the computers. Hopefully, it may be a little soft. She is going to speak this phrase. She has bulbar ALS. You'll hear the vocalizations. The speech itself will be difficult to discern. But what you'll then see appear on the screen is our decoding of that intended speech.
I don't want to call her a babysitter. That would be good. I did well in school.
So this is one example, and I'll show you a few more, of the decoding of intended speech just from the neural activity in cortex. Now, we gave her these phrases to repeat, and neuroscientifically, that's sort of cheating a little bit. That's giving her a whole lot of information, which gives us a chance to kind of know what she should be saying in response. The real way to test this is to provide an open-ended question and hear her response. So this is the real-time production of those words as decoded from her neural activity. It's really the phonemes that are being decoded initially, and those combinations of phonemes, again, using recurrent neural networks and language models, are being turned into those words, which are then here are being spoken aloud by the text-to-speech generator from the computer. I'll show just another couple examples of this. Actually, I think I'm going to show just one more for the moment. This is work from our BrainGate team out at UC Davis. And here's a gentleman also with bulbar ALS. I put a blue rectangle there on the screen. First, I just want to play out loud a phrase that he's saying. You'll hear again his dysarthric speech, but you'll hear his vocalizations. And I'll just play it again now with the phrase on the screen, and there'll be another second or two of the audio.
My nurse is very good.
So a few other things that are on the screen. First, the great work of Sergey, David, Maitri, and Nick, who are down there in the lower left-hand corner, and other colleagues on the BrainGate team. You'll notice that this says session 1 at the top. We started here using a 50-word vocabulary, and the PER and the WER are the phoneme error rate and the word error rate. What you just heard was one of the first sentences spoken, decoded, and spoken aloud by the computer on the very first day of using this BCI. He had received the BrainGate devices, the Utah arrays, in the clinical trial 30 days earlier, and did about 30 minutes of data collection before this video was taken. And you may have heard his inhalation and that sound at the end of saying the sentence, which was his initial emotional reaction to this working and working so quickly. So again, I had those phrases at the beginning, those mission statements about things working and allowing the restoration of communication and doing it tomorrow. What I mean by tomorrow is as soon as possible, not requiring months or weeks or even hours of training, but being able for these devices, for these types of implantable BCI systems, to be able to restore communication, restore some sort of external device control really quickly. And I believe that these devices are not only going to be able to get to the point of restoring communication, restoring mobility, but also to restore mental health and to recreate, maintain economic opportunity for people with neurologic injuries or other neurologic disorders. So with that, I'll highlight the great BrainGate team hard at work, as you can tell, at our annual summit meeting last summer. And with that, I just want to thank everybody at Everything ALS for the opportunity to join you today. Really looking forward to your questions, and I hope you'll join me in being really optimistic about the potential, not just for our BrainGate research, but for all implantable brain-computer interface research to restore communication and mobility for people with ALS and the not too distant future. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent presentation. And we've got a few questions, and Martha Beach and myself will be asking you those questions. For anybody else in the audience here, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put it in the chat and we will be moderating. And the first question, Dr. Leigh, is that the inclusion criteria seems broad for most of the BCI studies. Are there any specific exclusion criteria for these trials?
So I'll start with what's a kind of generic statement, which is that each trial has very specific inclusion criteria. You're right that many of them are general, and then each trial has slightly different kind of black and white written down inclusion criteria that, of course, as everyone on this call knows, are important to attend to in order to be eligible for any of those trials. So for any of them, I really encourage you to look into and to interact with the team itself. Broadly speaking, even though for some of these trials, including ours, we can recruit people either before or after a mechanical ventilation may be provided. We can recruit people fairly early on in the disease course or much later. At the moment, so far as I know, recruitment of the trial requires the ability to consent oneself. That is, in order to ask and answer questions about the trial. But I think most generally, in addition to meeting the inclusion criteria, for example, having weakness of all four limbs and or the inability or decreased speech from ALS or the other conditions, spinal cord injury, stroke, muscular dystrophy, generally people would need to be somewhat healthy. And healthy is a very broad term in this context, but one can imagine, because there's neurosurgery that's involved, if there was a serious risk of a cardiac event, for example, because of an underlying heart condition that would make anybody else a higher risk than usual for any surgery, that would probably be an exclusion criteria for many of the trials. And could go into much more detail, but clearly people in the trial have been mechanically ventilated. We have people who have been on or off anticoagulants. We've had people with any number of other disorders, as long as they are relatively minor, but kind of top of mind for all of us, no pun intended, I guess, is the importance of being able to be to reasonably be able to both understand and have a surgery that otherwise isn't necessarily medically indicated, because this is a research study.
Thank you. Martha?
Thank you, Dr. Hochberg. That was wonderful. Yes, this is such a hot topic. I can tell that people are very excited. So we have some people that are already looking into these studies. One in particular is Neuralink, and they were selected for the round 2. So they just received their selection for the interviews. The question is Neuralink's brain-computer interface device, how is that unique, or is it unique compared to the BCIs from other companies?
So the important that I at least say aloud that research disclosure slide that I had towards the beginning. So I really have the wonderful opportunity to interact with many of the brain-computer interface or implantable brain-computer interface companies through a clinical research support agreement that we have between Mass General and some of these companies, including Neuralink. So from that standpoint, I have some additional insight about each of these trials. I'm going to be both very careful in my response to say things that are only publicly available, but more importantly, I want to encourage everybody to ask those questions, whether it's of the company that you just mentioned or any of the other trials, directly to the research teams. But what I will say is that for each, and so as a result, I'll kind of be somewhat more broad in my response, which is that each device that's being either currently tested in a clinical trial or I hope soon will be, they're unique. They're unique in where they record from the brain. That is, how many different sites in the brain they may record from, how they're placed into or on the brain, the type of surgery that is involved, the way that they transmit or send that neural activity from one place to another. And those are all really important questions to learn about, and as one is exploring, whether it's through the interviews that you were just describing or any other interaction, it's really important to learn about those. There are devices that are what I would call intracortical, that is, they record from ensembles of neurons inside the brain. There are devices that record from on top of the brain, electrocorticographic devices. There's devices that record from vessels, like the superior sagittal sinus, that's sometimes referred to as a stent that can be placed, or a stentrode. And they will each have advantages and disadvantages. I personally hope that every one of them is successful. And by successful, I mean safe and showing efficacy through their clinical trials. And I would just, I encourage everybody to learn more about each of these trials, to find out if it seems like it's right for you, if it's right for your loved one, right for your friend, for the person you're caring for may have ALS, and to ask those types of questions. But I think all these devices will have pros and cons, but most importantly, I could list all those pros and cons, at least as I have them in my mind. But the risk benefit, so to speak, of any device is really best assessed by the person who's considering that device. I can offer a clinical opinion. I think that all of the trials that are being done are ones that are important for the field, and I think they have progress, as will the ones that are making progress, as will the ones that are coming up in the future. But this risk-benefit equation is not one that either a company or a doc can make on our own. It's one that's best weighed really carefully with as much information as you can get by the individuals considering enrolling in the trial. I think the one other thing that I'll say about this, and I hope I said it before, and if I did, I'll say it again. But the people who join us in these trials, the people who join these early feasibility clinical trials are doing so not because they're hoping to gain any personal benefit, but because they want to help us as a clinical and scientific community to test and further develop a technology that we all hope will help other people with ALS in the future. And it's really with that mindset that I'm encouraging people to think about these trials. We're going to learn more and more about these systems with time, and everything that we learn is going to be informed by the feedback that we get from the people who join these trials. So it's an amazing opportunity to provide that feedback early on. And I was having a conversation earlier today that really emphasized that some of the most important questions that have been posed and asked in this brain-computer interface field have been asked by the participants in our clinical trial who've been using the system and said, this is working pretty well, but could you do this? Or why is that happening? And the clinicians and scientists involved in the trial all look at each other and nod and say, that's an excellent question, or that's exactly the right idea, and that's exactly what we should do. So it's really in that context that I encourage people to think about these really important feasibility trials of implantable BCIs.
Oh, I think it's wonderful. And you don't know this, Dr. Hochberg, but I'm a neurosurgery critical care nurse with a husband with ALS. And I was at UCSF and Stanford and Ohio State. And listening to you talk about and see how this technology is advancing so quickly, and it's exciting. And I really think encouraging everyone to participate where they can is and helping out push the science further along. It's commendable what you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And you, at mentioning those institutions, have seen different types of brain-computer interface research that's all making great progress. And
amazing.
Everybody in this field is kind of encouraging everybody other to go, further as fast and as we can.
I'm amazed. Thank you.
And to that regard, the next question, Dr. Leigh, is when do you see the BCI to be able to move arms and, kind of limbs? And also, is this just more useful for people with bulbar ALS?
So each device is going to be is going to have a number of opportunities, and what in the academic realm, I'm going to try to make a distinction, which will be imperfect at best. That the academic research that's ongoing is really the basis for and all the progress that's been made, whether it be in our BrainGate studies or other academic studies. We collectively, through public funding and philanthropy, have been able to de-risk this field to the point that industry has now joined in and started multiple companies toward creating devices that we hope are going to successfully go through the important process of their early pilot clinical trials and subsequently pivotal trials. The reason for that long preamble is that the control over speech generation, or the ability to re-enable speech-based communication, or the control of a soft robotic device, they are both making progress now through the clinical research that's happening in academia. It'll be up to as we continue to pursue that, and we're doing both in our own BrainGate trials right now, early days, small numbers of participants, of course, but continuing to do it. The question is, how quickly will any of this be available, and how will each company, which ultimately will be the entity that manufactures and tests together with academics and supports the final form medical technologies, how will they link it together with other technologies, either for communication or for upper extremity control? And it's getting back to the IBCI-CC, the collaborative community that I was referring to before. The same arrays in the brain, there's a handful of arrays in the brain in a few different areas, could allow the same person to be able to use a speech generating technology, that is to use intended speech to be heard audibly again, or to control a limb that's become weakened as a result of ALS, together with, for example, a soft robotic arm. One of the challenges from a regulatory standpoint is usually a medical device has a fairly narrowly constrained use case. It's being tested traditionally in a small group of participants who are somewhat homogeneous. They often will have one disorder, not one of several disorders. And it's not common that an implanted medical device is paired with any number of other devices. Usually a system is developed from A to Z. That system is proposed, it is tested, it is assessed, and it either succeeds or doesn't in terms of its clinical trial. But just as you point out, these technologies have the ability to control multiple external devices, whether it be communication or mobility, and figuring out as a community of scientists and clinicians and regulatory bodies and ultimately funders and payers and reimbursers, how to do that, how to deal with the modularity of an implanted device plus multiple external effectors is a real challenge. It's a regulatory challenge. It's a scientific challenge. But we all want these devices to do as much as they can and not to be inadvertently limited in what they can do by kind of tradition, if you will. So this is one of the challenges that I think everybody in the field recognizes and that I hope is going to be assessed through and discussed through our collaborative community and other forums.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have another question specifically about the surface implant. And you touched on this a little bit. How heavy of an implant on the surface is it? Or light?
Light. Gosh, so these are all measured in grams, not in kilograms. Let's start there. In terms of the devices that are placed in or around the brain, I will now take as homework, because I've never actually thought about this question of exactly what each device weighs. I will, let me show you the, because I have one next to me, because that's what I keep on my desk. I'll show you just one of the devices, the device that we happen to use in the BrainGate research. This is the Utah array. It's made by BlackRock Microsystems, or Neurotech, sorry, in Salt Lake City. And I'm waving it around. This is not a good use of Zoom, but I'll now flip it up. This will never work. If I get the focus just right, you might see 100 tiny electrodes that are poking out from the top of this. See if I put my hand there, if that's any better. Yeah, not much.
Yes.
All right. So I don't know how to assess how many grams that is, except if I wave it up and down, it does that. So it's light. And certainly devices that would be placed on the brain itself are light. This particular connector, which is made of titanium, is a little bit heavier. This is what sits on the head. Our participants, when we ask them, a week or two after this is placed, do you feel that it's there? Sometimes they say no, or I've forgotten that it's there, or yes, I know that it's there, but it's not bothering me, and that's the kind of response that we get. But I should have a quantitative answer for you, and I don't. But I will next time somebody asks me. I'm hopefully going to have a better answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question is kind of related to what you answered, but is there a concern for implanted device, which is under the skull, for degradation of sensors? And also, is there a medical issue such as seizures, rejection of a body, immune system, attacks, anything you think is a concern?
So these are all, this really goes to the heart of the safety question for any implanted device. So I'll start by saying that we've had 18 participants in our BrainGate trial over 20 years. There are hundreds of thousands of people with deep brain stimulators for movement disorders. There's, I believe, even more than that of people who've had spinal cord stimulators for pain, and thousands who have had the NeuroPace device, which is a responsive neural stimulator used for the recording of brain activity and the stimulation or the modulation of brain activity for people with medically refractory seizures. So the concept of recording on and stimulating on or in the brain for years is not new. This is a for those technologies that I just described, standard of care for those conditions. If we move to the BCI space, we now have a somewhat more novel device or a handful of devices that are either going to be used or are currently being used in clinical trials. Each of them will go through its preclinical testing, and then each of them will go through its clinical trials, and we'll get more insight into that important question with time. The materials that are being used are materials that are being selected purposefully because there's been testing both on the bench and by textbook that would suggest that they are biocompatible. So the devices that are being placed are sterile. The devices that are being placed are or have materials that are purposefully being chosen for chronic placement into the brain. Even for devices that meet all those criteria, you asked another important question, which is about material degradation itself, which is sometimes referred to as the biostability, which is not the impact of the device on the brain, but the impact of being on the brain surrounded by CSF on the device. And one way to really look at this is to ask the question, for how many years, and hopefully it was measured in years, is the device providing, in our case at the moment, a research valuable signal and ultimately a clinically valuable signal. The device may or may not be perfectly biostable under the microscope, but if it's still providing a useful signal, then presumably that is a good thing. That's the reason that the device was placed in the first place. So, and just to try to answer each part of the question, there's a good hour or two that I could spend on each question, each part of that question. Questions about how the body reacts to the device that's been placed. There can be reactions, there are foreign body reactions that are commonly placed when devices are placed anywhere in the body. It's what the body's supposed to do. But the question is whether that reaction, that initial response, is one that affects the device performance in any way. And that sometimes can be looked at as a picture, as histology. There's other ways to assess the scientific question. But for me, as long as safety is paramount, the next question that I want to know, kind of skipping ahead, is, does the device work? Does the device work as planned? Does the device work, and does it provide the types of signals and restoration over time that we all want it to? And so I hope I addressed different aspects of that question, but it's a great one, and it's one that there's a lot more that we could consider.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Hochberg. Yes, that's the beauty of what you're doing. A brain surgery is not novel, and we've had a lot implanting devices in the brain is not new. So to go along with this, that's really helpful at this stage. So along that same thought, we have a question about including the exoskeleton, control of that. How far along or how far out do you think we are to incorporate? You were talking about hand control, but using the exoskeleton with it.
Yeah, so first I'd encourage anybody who's interested in learning more about those wearable robotics or their soft robotics to reach out to Connor Walsh at the Harvard School of Engineering, who's developing that suite of not only a glove, but also a elbow and a shoulder device. So he can tell you more about those. Some of those are in active clinical research as well, and there have been versions of that device that have also been used for other purposes for the lower extremity. So I think the soft robotics itself, that type of exoskeleton, is research that's continuing, combining the BCI and the soft robotics. Still early days that we're doing in the BrainGate realm. But I suspect that we'll see more of that in the future. And Martha, I just wanted to comment. You referenced something that's really important about these devices that are being placed, and I know how important drug, pharmaceutical, biologic research is in ALS. Right? Those are the approaches that will hopefully get to the word that we all want to hear, which is cure, or slowing of the progression of the disease. And that research is very different in so many ways because that drug, just a simple word, is kind of finished being designed, if you will, when it's provided. You may change the dose over the course of a clinical trial, but the drug itself isn't going to change because if it does, it's a different drug. That it's very different than early implantable device research, where we not only have the opportunity to update software, particularly if that software is external to the body during the trial, and make things better from that standpoint, but there's commonly some transition between the early clinical trial phase, commonly called a pilot trial, and the subsequent pivotal trial that may lead to either clearance or market approval. So the device can change with time. And in some cases, it might even change a little bit during the pilot trial. And often those changes occur as a result of what is learned the only way that it can be learned, which is through these early clinical trials.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's I think you answered this in some way or fashion, but question was, how portable are the various BCIs if someone has a BCI?
So it depends upon which one. There's one example. There's Utrecht was the word Utrecht appeared and there's a Utrecht neuroprosthesis that is a fully implantable system that all of the components of that system have been placed on a wheelchair, and people in that trial have used that device outside of their home. So that is one of the examples of fully implantable devices whose system has been made portable to the extent that it can be used outside the home with some of the components being placed on or around the wheelchair. The BrainGate system that I was showing you at the moment itself, the part that's on or in that the person's head, that's portable, sort of, but the rest of the system is truly a cart of electronics that's sitting next to the user. It can be made much smaller. Every time something's made smaller, there's a design decision that's being made not to be able to do something that one used to be able to do. So the balance is, what is it from a research standpoint that we're trying to learn? How do we get it to be reliable and on the back of the wheelchair all the time? How do we get or allow that person to use the system outside, certainly university laboratory or in their home, as we've been doing for years, and be able to use that system in another environment where the portability becomes really important. So progress being made. There is one good thing, at least at the moment, about external components that may or may not be portable, which is it's really easy to update something that's outside the body. A little more challenging to update something that has already been implanted. So that's why a lot of these systems have external components to them that can be swapped or updated readily. But nevertheless, the goal, like any other medical technology, like a cardiac pacemaker or a deep brain stimulator, the reason that this research is happening, what companies particularly are largely focused on, is having fully implanted devices that will be portable, because if they're not, it's not really a final form medical device. It's not one that I would think is going to have, from their standpoint, the type of acceptance and availability to the people who hope to benefit from it.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have a twofold question, specifically because we know even like with spinal cord injury, they may have other issues such as blindness. Can these BCIs, can a patient be in bed and use the BCI? Can they, if they are blind, for instance, could they use the BCI?
Two different questions. In bed, yes. We've had many of our participants, several of our participants at least, have used our investigational BrainGate system, and that research has been conducted while they've been in bed. There have been people who've been in wheelchair in their home and at other times in bed. So from a research standpoint, no issues, at least from our study. I won't go out of my way to speak about other studies. It's a question that should be asked of each individual study, but there's no immediate barrier to from that standpoint. For somebody who's unable to see, if we think about controlling a cursor on a computer screen, for example, some of that research is based on the visual feedback that's available. So at least in our BrainGate study right now, we're unable to recruit somebody who's truly unable to see. We've had people whose vision has been somewhat impaired, that often as the result of ALS, but who still is able to see, even if not completely, is able to see a computer screen for that type of interaction. There is a field of BCI or BCI-like research that's specifically to address blindness. But that is far out of my my domain of expertise, so I will leave that to others to describe.
Okay, thank you.
So the question is that BCI seems effective, and also your stats show that safe. When do you think, or when do you predict it can move from research into available treatments for communication?
So I'll take the opportunity just to say out loud again, I'm encouraged by the safety information that's available. Ours is an ongoing study. It's not a final study, and safety is determined. So I'll get to the important statement that you just made in just a moment. But safety gets determined at the end of the pivotal trial. But none of these devices are there yet, so can't say with as much as I'd like to say with the confidence that the person asking the question asked. We're not quite there yet, but I am encouraged by the safety profile of the devices, and this is why the field is making so much progress. In terms of time, a few years ago, if somebody asked, since they did, when are these devices going to be available? My response was somewhat imperfect, but it sounded like a decade, and there was a question mark at the end of that response. Now, seeing that there are systems that are in pilot trials and moving towards pivotal trials, seeing that the success, that is the clinical research type success that that ours and other similar studies are having, I think that time is now measured in years, and certainly not in decades. There's a lot to get to that moment of having an approved device and it being available to the community. Certainly, the device has to be demonstrated to be reasonably safe, which means that the risk-benefit ratio, which is the real question that we ask in medicine, needs to be appropriate for somebody to be able to make a decision that, yes, I'm willing to accept that perhaps slightly increased surgical risk in order to gain potentially the benefit that's associated with the device. Very individual decision, within a range of acceptable safety. In order to get through these trials, pilot trials will generally, if I had to guess, for most endeavors will take, with the exception of our academic ones, will take on the order of a couple years, maybe off by a year or so. Then there's often a pause, and then a pivotal trial begins. Those pivotal trials, unless I'm forgetting, which have not yet happened in the brain-computer interface space, we need to figure out how many participants are going to be in those trials and how long the devices are going to be demonstrated to work to get those trials done. But when we add all that together, it's certainly measured in years. It's no longer measured in decades, at least in my mind, which is really exciting. It's also way too long because I want to provide them tomorrow. I want it when somebody's in the ICU. I want them available now, and I know that feeling is shared. But this clinical research being done carefully and thoughtfully and learning as much as we can, as fast as we can, is really vital to making sure that the right devices, and I really hope it's plural, the multiple devices become available for people to choose from in the years ahead.
Thank you. And I just have a small, follow-up questions. Do they have to be ALS or can they be PLS as well?
So it depends on the trial. It is likely, but not definite, that some people with PLS may be able to be recruited into the trials. There may be some interaction if PLS wasn't specifically stated in the inclusion criteria in interacting with any of the regulatory bodies, either local or federal, that there may need to be an update. As I know, particularly in this audience, it's recognized that PLS, that is primary lateral sclerosis, is one that is generally believed to primarily affect upper motor neurons. Mm-hmm. And therefore, at least at a first pass, might be considered to be one that affects the motor cortex earlier, at least, than other versions of ALS. My sense is that this type of approach of intracortical or epicortical recording should work for somebody who has a diagnosis of PLS. I don't know that for sure. And the inclusion criteria one is an important one, but I think there will be opportunities to recruit people with PLS in these studies. And the first people with PLS who are in these studies are, much like the other participants in these studies, going to be pioneers. They're going to be people who are helping us to learn in ways that we can't otherwise learn about the safety and efficacy of these devices.
Great. And a lot of it we talked about was voluntary muscles. What about involuntary muscles, such as respiratory? Do you think BCI could help with respiratory function? As you know, ALS is, affects the respiratory in a big way for people.
So I don't think about the BCIs the way I usually think about them, as being ones that will play a major role, at least in supporting ventilation. As folks here undoubtedly know about some of the neuromodulation, or particularly one neuromodulation technology that was used with the goal of extending the time prior to mechanical ventilation, and that isn't a BCI. That's a stimulator, a phrenic nerve stimulator, that or diaphragmatic stimulator, that ultimately did not meet its clinical trial endpoints. And in fact, there was a surprising harm that was done, not on purpose, of course, but unfortunately that technology didn't work the way that anybody thought that it might in ALS. But I will say that even that trial was one where it was important to ask the question, and it was important to try. Nobody liked the outcome of that study. And I do think the BCI trials, with their encouraging safety record to date and what we're learning, is really a great reason for optimism. But again, even the people who enrolled in that trial, they deserve a tremendous credit for helping us to learn something that there was no way to learn any other way.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Christian has got one last question. Christian?
Yep. It's essentially a question that you mentioned early on about the role that AI is playing. Obviously, of course, in interpretation. I was wondering, how fast do you see AI accelerating that decoding and expression and an understanding of expression of people's thoughts? And what's the role that AI programmers and developers and organizations like ours can play, really, as people, citizen-driven research, and people contributing their efforts?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'll start off with the disclosure that I'm a card-carrying neuroscientist. So I went into this field, whether it's my PhD work or in the earlier days of this field, quite confident that the way towards successful brain-computer interface was going to be to really understand what is encoded in each action potential, or each pattern of action potentials in the brain. There's 100 years of trying to figure out exactly how different parts of the brain control movement. If we can understand the neuroscience of that, we're going to be able to decode it. And then came along the computer scientists and the experts in AI and ML, who, to say surprised us all, and disappointed isn't quite the right word, because we're all excited, but the speed and the power with which those technologies, which basically create a map agnostic to any hypothesis between the neural activity and its intended use, it's just the power that brings can't be overstated. So what that means is that there's anything that can be done to advance the use of these models in BCI research, which as an academic often means the funding that's required to have the very best, fastest processors and RAM, talking in kind of boring computer language at the moment, but to really be able to create the models and have the kind of speed that we want in decoding speech or decoding intended three-dimensional reach and grasp movements. A lot of this is going to be, at least in the near term, dependent upon the resources that we can bring to bear in an AI ML realm. And it's really exciting that it works. I'll get over the disappointment that we don't have to know quite as much neuroscience as I thought we were going to have to know, because in reality, eventually, these same approaches are also going to tell us more about how the human brain functions. And then we're going to be able to take that knowledge and feed it back to make even better next generation BCIs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hochberg. This was so informative, and thank you for giving us an hour and 15 minutes of your time. And I know how busy you are, with treating patients and running your research. So we really appreciate it. And we really thank you for your time and all the work you're doing.
Thanks so much, Indu, and thanks everybody for joining in tonight. And if people are interested in learning more about our BrainGate research, available at just website braingate.org or clinicaltrials@braingate.org. And again, I just want another shout out to all of the trials and in any of the academic institutions that may be near you, any of the industry partners who you saw on today's presentation. Reach out to them if you're interested in just learning more about them. Those registries, they'll all provide more information, and then you'll know early, and you'll be able to make informed decisions as more and more information becomes available.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Leigh.
You bet.
Well, folks, once again, in your living room, Leigh, thank you for your smiles. You really made people feel like you're on their team. And there's not a lot of difference between you and us because we're all humans trying to do good. And to have you present like this gives us some breathing room that somebody's working for us. And that hits our heart and shows us hope dies last, not us. So, folks, please bring your heart and soul to these gatherings so that everyone here that you see can benefit from your experience, because as has been said, no one knows this disease better than us. And so we are research citizen driven, and there's nothing better that would make us personally feel better than us contributing. Okay, everybody, now you've seen these folks for quite a while. I'm sure there's somebody who you just want to say goodnight to, and it was a pleasure to see you today. And so pick out somebody and say what's in your heart. Go ahead. Okay, Michael, there. Oh, Patty.
Good night, McFinn.
All right, David.
Good night, Jerry.
Good night, everybody.
Heart.
Love, love.
Dom, great to see you, Dom. Tony, take care of that heart next to you. I know you do.
Hi, Gary.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, all. Good night, all.
Eric, Brown,
Kev.
love you. Ruth.
Stay
my
well.
God.
Love you.
Hey, Gary.
Stay well, everyone.
Give me a smile. There it is.
Thanks,
Hey, that's all you
McFinn.
gotta do.
Thanks, McFinn.
Good night,
Brandy.
Dr. Lee.
Night,
I
Eric.
really like that smile on your face, Brandy. That's the first time I've met you.
Indu.
I
Thank
met
you,
your
Indu.
smile.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Joe Redmond. Oh my gosh. You know, people just disappear slowly, and that's so beautiful. Thank you. Good night, Sue. And Rita, once again, thanks again for coming.
Night,
Oh,
Jose.
it's a pleasure.
Yes, what a
Night,
pleasure for all of us. All right, Scott, take your angel next to you.
Bye,
You
Ruth.
got another. Thank you.
Indu. Good night.
Yeah, good night, all.
Hochberg.
Good night, Mara.
Do the hearts. Good night.
Jose,
Right, Jose.
aloha.
Good to see you.
Eddie, oh my gosh, Peter, Kim. Okay, folks, it's that time. Hey, Jubilant. Thank you, Jubilant, for being here. Like I say, I always like to speak your name. And with that, folks, please say a prayer for everybody. Eddie, good night, Eddie.
Good night.
We got you in our heart and soul. So say your prayers, include everybody in them, and make sure that you really love yourselves, because you're all so precious. Just believe.
You
And
too.
All right. Good night, Ruby.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Yeah, good
All
night, all.
right.
Brandy.
Good night.
We're going to press that button. Bye, Leigh.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
All right.
Bye, Leigh.
Good night.
Bye, Lynn.